While walking back from an evening bow hunt, I had about a mile walk through the swamps here in Louisiana. While walking with a small flashlight, I started to hear something following in the leaves behind me. I stopped, spun around, and it stopped. I start, and it started. I again looked with a small light and couldn't see anything. I start to hear coyotes, and in my mind I'm thinking I'm being stalked. I take my large flashlight out and scan the woods. The closer I get to the truck, the faster I walk, and the faster the sound gets as well. By the time I get to the edge of the wood line, I'm almost in a full sprint. Alone and armed only with my bow as I clear the woods, the noise stops. I sling my stand off my shoulders and grab my 9mm out of my truck and get ready for whatever is about to clear the woods. 5 minutes pass and nothing happens. As I load my stand into my truck, I noticed that the rope I used to pull my bow up had got untied and was dragging in the leaves behind me. Yeah, I ran for my pull-up rope. When I was a freshman in college in 1991, WVU Let's Go Mountaineers always had Thanksgiving break during opening week of rifle season in West Virginia. I had traveled the 3-hour trip home to hunt with my stepdad for opening morning. A few years previous to this deer season, my stepdad had undergone bypass surgery, so the amount of physical activity he was permitted by his doctor was somewhat limited. We were hunting at the bottom of a long hill, which was about 200 yards to the creek from our truck. I left my stepdad at the bottom of the hill and proceeded around the ridge to my stand. It wasn't long after daybreak that I heard the report of his rifle, so I gathered my things and headed back in his direction. When I got to his stand, I found my stepdad in the creek with a nice 8 PT. He had just finished field dressing it and was tying the drag rope around the antlers. Knowing he shouldn't be dragging the deer, I told him to carry the guns and I would drag the buck up the long hill to the truck. This is where the story gets interesting. The bank coming out of the creek was very steep for the first 10 to 15 feet or so. It had rained earlier that week and the bank was plenty muddy. As you can imagine, I took 1 step forward and slid 3 steps back. Getting frustrated, I told my stepdad that I was going to throw the buck over my shoulder to carry it the short distance out of the creek, and then I would lay it down and drag it the rest of the way to the truck. I had my stepdad hold the deer waist high, and I bent over to sling the deer up on my shoulder. Straining, I finally stood upright with the deer. You guessed it, my head went fully inside the carcass. The problem now was that I was so tired that I couldn't lift it off. I had to bend over and let it slide off of my head. Needless to say, my head and face was covered with blood and whatever else remained in the deer after field dressing. I hadn't eaten breakfast that morning, so now I am running around in circles gagging, trying to barf, but my stomach was totally empty. As you can imagine, my stepdad was quite amused by this. "Way to go, college boy," I think was the phrase he used. Needless to say, I finally managed to get the deer to the top of the hill. By this time, I am exhausted lying beside the truck, still covered in blood from the deer. A gentleman from the power company happened to be driving by as I lay on the ground trying to catch my breath. He slammed on his brakes and ran his truck in the ditch. He jumped out and said, "Oh my God, what can I do?" He thought I had been shot. He and my stepdad both got a good laugh at my expense once he realized the only thing hurt was my pride. I suppose on the bright side, I did get a heck of a story to tell. And believe me, the inside of a dead deer is nowhere you want to stick your head anytime soon. This happened to my dad and his hunting buddy. They were in a remote section of southeastern Wyoming hunting for elk. Like any good elk hunter, they were up at 3:30 a.m. to stake out their spot and watch the herd patterns before daylight. As they were driving up to the spot, a figure appeared in their headlights, and by their silhouette, it wasn't a hunter. What was a person doing walking down the road in complete darkness with no hunting gear? My dad was driving, so he slowed to a crawl in his truck, and his buddy prepared his sidearm, as this had foul play written all over it. When they could distinguish the figure in the headlights, they saw it was a girl in a tank top and underwear, with no shoes on. They stopped and verbally checked her status out the window, as there could have easily been somebody staked out in the sagebrush, ready to ambush. When it was clear she was severely hypothermic and bleeding from her feet, they got out and let her in the truck cab. From there, it had to have been a terrifying experience for that girl. I sure wouldn't want two middle-aged rednecks picking me up 40 miles from any town. They cranked up the heat full blast and drove her to a nearby country gas station where they were regular customers and friends with the owner and his wife, who was a retired nurse. When the girl could finally articulate her words, she told them that she and her boyfriend drove out there to make out. When she started having a seizure, she was epileptic. He lost his temper, grabbed her shoes, and threw them into the sage. When she got out of the car to find them, he peeled off, leaving her in near-freezing temperatures in her skivvies. She estimated she walked about 4 miles on a dirt road before my dad found her. It's a good thing hunters start early because she easily could have died. My father and I were following a trail for a while, so we decided to take a break and catch our breaths. I sat on a log off the trail, and my dad stood on the edge of the trail waiting for me to get up. I hear some movement and scan around, and I see a man, dressed casually, walking quickly down the trail with a Glock in his hand. He's not really following the trail, he's just walking toward my dad with haste. Before he comes up to my dad, he asks if he's seen anything. Pretty normal. I keep an eye on him because I don't believe he was there to hunt. I think he was there to make sure my dad hadn't seen anything he wasn't supposed to. He wasn't dressed like a hunter, he didn't walk like a hunter, and it was deer season, and he decided he would take his Glock out to get a deer. I wasn't buying, so I put a round in the chamber and watched them talk. He seemed to be confident until my dad mentioned that he was here with me and gestured in my direction. I nodded and made a half-assed wave, and he seemed to lose interest in us and ended the conversation shortly after and turned around and walked back the way he came, just about as fast as he walked up to us. It worried us a bit, but we continued on. We haven't been back to that area in a while. My dad told me that there have been drug busts near that area in the past. This isn't a supernatural tale, just an experience that made me not want to go back to that area. When I was a boy, my parents used to take me and my older sister to my relative's house in eastern KY. Right around Letcher Company, the closest city is Whitesburg. My uncle, who taught me everything I know about the outdoors, lived in a cabin nestled in a holler way back up in the mountains. His place was at the base of a big strip mine seam up on the mountainside. As a boy, he and I used to go sit out on his back porch at night and use predator calls to try and call something down out of the hills. Well, one night he and I were out there using one of his tapes. We'd been out there for a good 2 hours and seen nothing, so we were thinking of calling it a night. We were about to pack everything up when he realized his squirrel feeder was empty. He then decided to go fill it back up with seed. His feeder was about 50 yards away from his cabin on the mountainside and bordered the tree line. He walked up the hillside about 25 yards when his wife came out to see why we were still outside. The only light out that night was the light from his porch. He was about 35 yards up the hill, and he called back and said he forgot his flashlight, so his wife, my aunt, went back inside and got one of his spotlights. We had forgot to turn off the tape with the predator calls on it, so I reached down to the tape player to turn it off when I noticed my aunt was as stiff as a board. I hit the off button and looked up at her, and she had the spotlight shining straight up to the squirrel feeder where my uncle was at. I heard her say, "It's coming to you, Jim." Jim is my uncle's name. He turned back and goes, "Huh?" Then a little louder that time she goes, "It is coming straight towards you, Jim." That's when I looked up and saw a set of eye shines about 15 feet away from where my uncle was standing and closing in. Whatever it was massive. The eyes were about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. Also, whatever that creature was completely and totally got the drop on my uncle, who has pretty much spent his whole life in the woods studying and tracking predators. Well, he was turned around looking at us with his back to the woods, so we told him to freeze. We all just kind of stood there for about 3 mins, which seemed like a lifetime. It was dead silent, no crickets, no sounds of the night. It was the most eerie and creepy 3 mins of my life. It just sat there at the tree line staring at us all, and us staring right back at it. The brush at the tree line was thick, so we could not see what shape it was, just the eyes and where they were in relation to the ground. After those 3 mins, my uncle slowly turned around to see what was about 15 feet away from him. With our spotlight on it, as he was about to turn and look it directly in the eyes, it split. And for the next 15 mins, we could hear limbs cracking and snapping all the way up the side of the mountain as this animal decided to retreat. Scared the heck out of me, and my uncle, literally. My uncle wet himself. I think that was the thing that scared me the most about it, was that he was so scared. He was shaking, and I had never seen him like that. The other thing that scared us both is that we had been sitting out there all night listening intently and watching that tree line like hawks. Whatever animal or creature it was did not make a single sound coming down the side of that mountain. It never made a sound until it took off. I didn't sleep that night, and neither did my aunt or uncle.